The hook. Jack's knees hit the sand hard enough to send shockwaves up his spine, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the ice spreading through his chest. Danny's lips barely moved, each word a struggle that seemed to drain what little strength remained in his paralyzed body. "My father knows what happened," Danny repeated, his voice barely a whisper against the desert wind. "He's been waiting for you to come back." The film set erupted into controlled chaos around them. Chuck Norris barked orders at the assistant director while keeping his weathered face carefully neutral. 40 years in Hollywood had taught him when to ask questions and when to stay silent. The camera operator finally killed the recording. Crew members scattered like startled birds, some rushing toward the craft services table, others suddenly finding urgent business with equipment that had been working perfectly moments before. But Jack couldn't move. He stared down at Danny's face, 23 years old, stubble-chinned, with the same fierce determination that had gotten him this job despite being green as spring grass. The same age Tommy Chen had been when... "Sir?" The paramedic's voice cut through Jack's spiral. When had the ambulance arrived? The EMT knelt beside Danny with professional calm, but Jack caught the tightness around his eyes. He'd seen this kind of injury before. "We need to move him. Can you step back?" Jack forced himself upright, his legs unsteady beneath him. The desert heat pressed against his skin like a living thing, but he felt cold, hollow. 15 years he'd convinced himself it was over, that the nightmares would fade, that he could direct one last film and ride quietly into retirement with his reputation intact. "Jack," Chuck's voice, low and careful. The action star had moved close enough to speak without being overheard. At 64, Chuck Norris had survived 3 decades of Hollywood by knowing which battles to fight and which secrets to keep. "This wasn't your fault." But even as Chuck said it, Jack saw the question lurking behind his eyes. Because Chuck had been there that night in 1989, not when Tommy died, that had happened during a closed rehearsal, but afterward, when the studio lawyers descended like vultures and the stories got carefully aligned. Chuck knew about the insurance investigation that followed, the questions that never quite got answered, the way Jack's career had skyrocketed while Tommy Chen's family got a settlement check and a non-disclosure agreement. "The investigator," Jack managed. His throat felt like sandpaper. "Where is he?" Chuck's eyes flicked toward the monitors. The man who'd been standing there, mid-50s, salt and pepper beard, wearing a rumpled suit despite the desert heat, had vanished, like smoke, like he'd never been there at all. "What investigator?" Chuck's voice carried a warning. They both knew cameras were rolling even when they weren't supposed to be, that every conversation on a film set was potentially recorded, archived, scrutinized. "I saw Danny's father. Nice guy, proud of his son." Father. The word hit Jack like a physical blow. Danny Reeves. He'd known that name sounded familiar when the casting director brought the young stuntman in for the job. Reeves, not Chen. That would have been too obvious, too easy to catch. But the insurance investigator who'd hounded him for months after Tommy's death, who'd made Jack's life a living hell until the studio lawyers finally made him back off. What had his name been? Michael Reeves. The ambulance pulled away in a cloud of dust and diesel exhaust, taking Danny toward whatever uncertain future waited in a hospital bed. The crew began the careful dance of striking the set, their movements efficient but subdued. Nobody made eye contact with Jack. Word traveled fast on film sets, and everyone knew what a paralyzed stuntman meant: lawsuits, investigations, careers ending in boardrooms instead of on screen. Jack walked toward his trailer on autopilot, his mind spinning through the implications. If Danny was Michael Reeves's son, then this whole production was suspect. The screenplay that had landed on his agent's desk 18 months ago, was it really written by an unknown screenwriter or carefully crafted bait? The location scouting that had brought them to this particular stretch of the Mojave, the fight choreography that had specifically requested the same sequence that killed Tommy Chen, even Chuck's involvement. How much of it was real, and how much was an elaborate trap 15 years in the making? His phone buzzed. Unknown number. The text message contained only an address in Las Vegas and a time, 8 p.m. tonight. Below that, a single line that made his hands shake: "Come alone, or the video goes public." Jack closed his eyes and felt the desert sun burning against his eyelids. Because of course there was a video. In 1989, security cameras were rare, film was expensive, and people still believed some secrets could stay buried. But now, in 2004, everything was digital, everything was recorded, everything lived forever in ones and zeros on hard drives that never forgot. Michael Reeves hadn't given up. He'd been planning. And Jack Morrison, legendary stuntman, respected director, keeper of Hollywood's darkest secrets, was about to discover just how patient a grieving father could be. The ghost hadn't just come back. It wanted revenge. Introduction. The trailer door slammed shut behind him with a hollow bang that echoed off the aluminum walls. Jack stood in the sudden dimness, breathing hard, his phone still clutched in his trembling hand. The text message glowed on the small screen like an accusation. "Come alone, or the video goes public." Outside, he could hear the crew breaking down equipment, the metallic clatter of light stands, the rumble of generators winding down, voices calling out logistics for the early wrap. Normal sounds of a film set, but they felt distant now, as if he were hearing them through water, through 15 years of carefully constructed lies. Jack sank into the worn leather chair behind his desk, surrounded by the detritus of a career that had spanned 4 decades. Stunt coordinator awards lined the narrow shelves, their brass nameplates catching the filtered light from the small window. Photos covered every available surface. Jack with Stallone on the Rocky set, with Jackie Chan in Hong Kong, with a young Chuck Norris back when they were both hungry and fearless and thought broken bones were just the price of admission to immortality. But it was the frame he kept face down in the desk drawer that mattered now. Jack's hands moved of their own accord, pulling it out, turning it over. The photo was from 1988, taken at the wrap party for Death Strike, the film that had made Jack's reputation and should have launched Tommy Chen into stunt stardom. 22 faces grinning at the camera, sunburned and exhausted and drunk on the kind of camaraderie that only came from risking your life alongside people who understood the cost. Tommy stood in the back row, his arms slung around Jack's shoulders, 23 years old, with that cocky smile that made directors trust him with their most dangerous sequences. He'd reminded Jack of himself at that age, all raw talent and reckless ambition, convinced that the next job would be the one that changed everything. Jack traced Tommy's face with his finger, remembering the weight of the kid's arm across his shoulders, the smell of cheap beer and desert dust on his clothes. Tommy had called him Shifu sometimes, teacher, picked up from the Hong Kong stunt crews they'd worked with. It had embarrassed Jack then, made him feel older than his 38 years. Now it felt like a brand burned into his conscience. The photo trembled in his hands. Somewhere in Las Vegas, Michael Reeves was waiting with a video that could destroy everything Jack had built since that terrible night. But what terrified him more than the threat of exposure was the memory of the promise he'd made to himself in the months afterward, when the nightmares were still fresh and Tommy's blood still stained his dreams. Never again. Never let yourself care that much about someone you could lose. It had been easy enough to follow. Jack had spent 15 years keeping everyone at arm's length, agents, directors, the endless parade of young stuntmen who looked at him with the same hero worship that had once shone in Tommy's eyes. He'd learned to be respected rather than loved, admired rather than trusted. It was safer that way. Cleaner, except for Sarah. Jack pulled out his phone with numb fingers, scrolling through his contacts until he found her number. His daughter, the one person who'd managed to slip past his defenses, not through any failing of his willpower, but through the simple fact that she'd existed before Tommy died, before Jack learned how much it could cost to love someone in this business. Sarah Morrison Burke, the contact read. She'd hyphenated her name when she married David, kept Morrison as a connection to the father she'd forgiven for missing most of her childhood. 28 years old now, with 2 kids of her own and a house in the San Fernando Valley that Jack visited every other Sunday, bearing gifts and carefully edited stories about his latest projects. The last text she'd sent was from Tuesday, Dad. Emma's ballet recital is Saturday at 3. Please don't miss this one. She's been practicing your favorite song. Emma, his granddaughter, 5 years old, with Sarah's dark eyes and Jack's stubborn chin. She'd started calling him Papa Jack last Christmas, insisted on sitting in his lap while he told sanitized versions of his stunt stories, adventures where nobody ever got hurt, where the good guys always won, where courage and skill were enough to keep the people you loved safe. Jack closed his eyes and saw Emma's face, bright with excitement as she spun across a stage in a pink tulle dress. Then he saw Tommy's face, slack with death on a soundstage floor. Two images that shouldn't have any connection, separated by decades in completely different worlds, but linked now by the terrible arithmetic of consequences. If the video went public, if the truth about Tommy's death came out, it wouldn't just destroy Jack's reputation, it would destroy the myth he'd built for his family, the grandfather who'd been a hero, who'd lived an exciting life without ever really hurting anyone. Emma would grow up knowing that Papa Jack was the kind of man who chose his career over the truth, who let a grieving family suffer to protect himself. Outside, an engine roared to life. Through the window, Jack watched the last of the equipment trucks pull away, leaving tire tracks in the sand like scars. Soon it would just be him and the desert and the weight of a choice he should have made 15 years ago. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was Sarah. "Love you, Dad. Drive safe coming back from location." Jack stared at the message until his vision blurred. Then he stood up, grabbed his keys, and walked back into the heat. Las Vegas was a 4-hour drive through the gathering dusk. It was time to face his ghosts. Chapter 3. Inciting Incident. The first 2 hours of the drive passed in a blur of asphalt and sagebrush, Jack's mind cycling through scenarios, each one worse than the last. He'd kept the radio off, needing the silence to think, but the quiet only amplified the questions hammering against his skull. How long had Michael Reeves been planning this? How had he gotten Danny onto the production? And most importantly, what exactly was on that video? Jack's phone sat in the cup holder like a coiled snake, its screen dark but somehow still menacing. He'd turned off the ringer after Sarah's text, unable to bear the thought of more normal life intruding on this nightmare. The irony wasn't lost on him. For 15 years he'd been waiting for the past to catch up, and now that it had, all he wanted was to pretend it hadn't happened. The exit for Las Vegas appeared like a mirage through his windshield, neon bleeding into the desert twilight. Jack had been here countless times over the years, industry parties, film premieres, the kind of networking events that kept careers alive in Hollywood. But tonight the city felt foreign, hostile. Every billboard and casino sign seemed to mock him with their promises of luck and fortune. The address from the text led him to a part of Vegas he'd never seen, old motels and pawn shops, the kind of neighborhood that existed in the shadows of the Strip's glittering excess. Jack pulled into the parking lot of the Desert Rose Motor Inn, a 2-story relic from the 1960s with faded pink stucco and a neon sign missing half its letters. Room 237. Second floor, end of the walkway. Jack climbed the external stairs on unsteady legs, his boots echoing off the concrete. The desert air still held the day's heat, but sweat beaded on his forehead anyway. At the door, he hesitated, his fist raised to knock. Once he crossed this threshold, there would be no going back. The careful life he'd built, the reputation, the relationships, the delicate balance between truth and fiction, all of it would be subject to Michael Reeves's mercy. The door opened before he could knock. Jack Morrison. The voice was exactly as he remembered it, measured, deliberate, with the flat affect of someone who'd spent years asking uncomfortable questions. Michael Reeves looked older, his dark hair now silver at the temples, lines carved deep around his eyes. But the gaze was the same. Intelligent, relentless, unforgiving. "Thank you for coming." The motel room was spartanly furnished but meticulously organized. A laptop sat open on the small desk, its screen casting blue light across stacks of manila folders. Photographs were pinned to the wall above the bed, surveillance shots of Jack arriving at various film sets, leaving restaurants, playing with Emma in a park. The sight of his granddaughter's face in this context made Jack's stomach clench. "You've been watching me." It wasn't a question. For 15 years. Michael moved to the desk, his movements careful and controlled. "Did you really think I'd given up? That a settlement check and a legal threat would make me forget what you did to my nephew?" Nephew. The word hit Jack like a physical blow. Tommy Chen was my sister's son. Lily married Robert Chen in 1963, had one beautiful boy and lost him because of your negligence. Michael's voice remained steady, but his hands clenched at his sides. She died in 1998, Jack. Cancer. But even at the end, she'd ask me if I'd found the truth about Tommy's death, if the man responsible had ever been held accountable. Jack felt the room spinning around him. In all his nightmares about exposure, he'd never considered that Tommy's family might have connections, networks, people who'd never stop looking for answers. Michael, what happened that night? It was an accident. The safety line failed, the rigging gave way. No. Michael turned the laptop screen toward him. This is what happened that night. The video quality was grainy. The timestamp in the corner reading March 15th, 1989, 11:47 p.m. A security camera Jack had never known existed, mounted high in the corner of Soundstage 7. The angle was wrong, the lighting poor, but the figures moving through the frame were unmistakable. Jack watched himself check the rigging one final time before the rehearsal. Watched Tommy climb into position, trusting and eager. Watched the moment when everything went wrong, not because of equipment failure, but because of the modification Jack had made to the safety harness. A modification that shaved 2 seconds off the sequence, but introduced a stress point that would fail under the exact conditions of the stunt. On screen, Jack knelt beside Tommy's broken body. But instead of calling for help immediately, instead of trying to save him, Video Jack spent precious seconds examining the harness, understanding what had gone wrong, calculating the implications for his career. Only then did he scream for the medics. 43 seconds, Michael said softly. You knelt there for 43 seconds, watching my nephew die, thinking about how to save yourself. That's not negligence, Jack. That's murder. The laptop screen went dark, but the images burned in Jack's retinas. 15 years of carefully constructed justifications crumbled in an instant. He'd told himself so many times that it was an accident, that he'd done everything possible to save Tommy, that the modifications to the harness were standard practice. But the video didn't lie. He'd chosen his career over a human life, and now Michael Reeves had proof. What do you want? Jack's voice came out as a whisper. Michael smiled, and it was the coldest thing Jack had ever seen. I want you to confess, publicly, completely, and I want you to face the consequences you should have faced 15 years ago. And if I don't, then this video gets released to every major news outlet in the country. Your granddaughter will grow up knowing exactly what kind of man her Papa Jack really is. Michael closed the laptop with deliberate care. You have 24 hours to decide. Jack stumbled toward the door, his vision blurring. In the parking lot, he vomited beside his car until nothing was left but bile and regret. The drive back to Los Angeles stretched ahead of him like a prison sentence. Behind him lay the truth he'd spent 15 years running from. Ahead waited the family he'd built on a foundation of lies. There was no escape. There never had been. The ghosts had finally come home. Chapter 4, Early Development. Jack drove through the night in a fugue state, the highway lines blurring together like broken promises. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white, but he couldn't feel them anymore. Couldn't feel anything except the hollow ache in his chest where his carefully constructed world used to be. 24 hours. The words echoed in his mind like a death sentence. By this time tomorrow, either he'd be standing in front of television cameras confessing to manslaughter, or Michael Reeves would have destroyed everything Jack had spent 15 years building. His reputation, his relationships, his granddaughter's hero worship, all of it reduced to ash and regret. The sun was rising by the time Jack reached his Malibu house, painting the Pacific a deep orange that reminded him too much of the desert where Danny Reeves, Michael's son, lay paralyzed in a hospital bed. Jack sat in his driveway for 10 minutes, staring at the Spanish tile roof and manicured landscaping that represented everything he'd gained from Tommy Chen's death. The stunt coordinator fees, the director opportunities, the respect of an industry that never looked too closely at the bodies left in its wake. Inside, the house felt like a mausoleum. Photos lined the hallway. Jack with various celebrities, industry awards, candid shots of family gatherings where everyone smiled and pretended the past didn't matter. But now every image seemed contaminated, tainted by the knowledge of what he'd done to earn his place in those frames. His phone had been buzzing incessantly during the drive, but Jack had ignored it. Now, in the artificial quiet of his living room, he finally checked the messages. 17 missed calls, 43 texts. The vultures were already circling. The first call was from his agent, Marcus Webb. Jack deleted it without listening. Then 2 more from Marcus, increasingly frantic. A call from the studio executive overseeing the Chuck Norris project. 3 calls from insurance investigators, different ones from Michael Reeves, but with the same relentless hunger in their voices when they left messages about reviewing the incident and scheduling preliminary interviews. But it was the text from Sarah that made his hands shake. "Dad, I saw the news about your stunt coordinator. Is everything okay? Call me when you get this." The news. Jack fumbled for the television remote, his fingers clumsy with exhaustion and fear. CNN was running a breaking news banner, stuntman paralyzed on Chuck Norris film set. The footage was shaky cell phone video, probably shot by one of the crew members, showing the ambulance pulling away from the location. Jack's own face flashed on screen, a publicity photo from last year's Variety interview about his comeback. "Raises questions about safety protocols in the film industry," the anchor was saying. Morrison, a veteran stunt coordinator whose career spans 4 decades, previously worked on the 1989 production where stuntman Thomas Chen died in a similar accident. Jack stabbed the power button, plunging the room into silence. But the damage was done. They were already making the connection, drawing lines between Tommy's death and Danny's paralysis. Soon someone would start digging deeper, asking why the same coordinator was involved in 2 similar accidents 15 years apart. His phone rang again, Marcus Webb, persistent as ever. This time Jack answered. "Jesus Christ, Jack. Where have you been? I've been trying to reach you for hours." Marcus's voice carried the particular strain of an agent watching his commission disappear in real time. "The studio's going insane. They're talking about halting production, launching a full investigation." "Marcus." Jack's voice sounded foreign to his own ears, hollow and defeated. "I need you to clear my calendar. Clear your—" "Jack, are you listening to me? This is a disaster, but it's manageable. We get out ahead of it, control the narrative. Tragic accident, thoughts and prayers for the family, full cooperation with investigators. The usual playbook." The usual playbook. How many times had Jack seen this dance performed in Hollywood? The careful choreography of lawyers and publicists, designed to contain scandal and minimize liability. He'd participated in it himself 15 years ago, watched the studio machinery grind Michael Reeves's questions into dust and legal settlements. "The kid's father," Jack said quietly. "What do we know about him?" A pause on the other end. The sound of papers rustling. "Danny Reeves, 24, trained at the International Stunt School, clean record. Father's name is—" More rustling. "Michael Reeves, insurance investigator. Why?" Because Michael Reeves had spent 15 years planning this moment. Because everything, the screenplay, the location, the specific stunt sequence, had been orchestrated to bring Jack to this exact point. Because the ghost Jack thought he'd buried had been patiently, methodically, building a trap that was finally ready to spring. "Jack, you there? I need to think, Marcus. Give me some time." "Time? Jack, we don't have time. The phones are ringing off the hook. Entertainment Tonight wants a statement. The trades are already running pieces about your safety record. If we don't get out ahead of this—" Jack hung up and turned off the phone. Outside, the ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, indifferent to human guilt and consequence. Jack stood at his living room window, watching seagulls wheel through the morning air, and tried to remember what it felt like to believe in his own innocence. But that man was gone, buried under 15 years of lies that were finally crumbling. Somewhere in Las Vegas, Michael Reeves was waiting for his answer. And somewhere in a Los Angeles hospital, Danny Reeves was learning to live without the use of his legs, never knowing that his father had orchestrated his fall. The trap was perfect. And Jack Morrison, legendary stuntman, respected director, keeper of Hollywood's darkest secrets, was finally out of places to run. #Chapter 5, Middle Development. Jack stood at his window until the sun climbed high enough to burn the marine layer from the ocean, watching the world continue its indifferent rotation while his own universe collapsed inward. The weight of Michael Reeves's ultimatum pressed against his chest like a physical thing, making each breath a conscious effort. 24 hours. In 23 hours and 17 minutes, his choice would determine whether he destroyed himself or allowed Michael to destroy him. The house phone rang, the landline he'd kept for emergencies, the number only family knew. Jack stared at it for 4 rings before answering, already knowing what he'd hear. "Dad?" Sarah's voice carried that particular note of worry he remembered from her teenage years, when she'd wait up for him to come home from increasingly dangerous shoots. "I've been trying to reach you all morning. Your cell goes straight to voicemail." "I'm fine, sweetheart." The lie came automatically, practiced from years of protecting her from the uglier aspects of his profession, just dealing with some production issues. "Production issues?" Sarah's voice sharpened. "Dad, they're saying on the news that someone was paralyzed, that it was the same kind of stunt that killed that man in 1989. Tommy Chen." Even now, 15 years later, Sarah couldn't say his name. She'd been 13 when it happened, old enough to understand that her father's late nights and haunted silences were connected to a young man's death, but too young to grasp the full implications. Jack had told her it was a tragic accident, that he'd done everything possible to save Tommy, that sometimes bad things happened despite everyone's best efforts. Another lie in a career built on lies. "These things happen in our business," Jack said, hating himself for the words. "Safety protocols fail, equipment malfunctions. But twice? With the same person in charge?" Sarah's background was in journalism before she'd married David and focused on raising the kids. She had an instinct for inconsistencies, for stories that didn't quite add up. "Dad, are you in some kind of trouble?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Jack closed his eyes and saw Emma's face again, not the bright, trusting smile from his memories, but a future version twisted with disgust and betrayal. "Papa Jack? He's the man who let people die to protect himself. He's the monster who chose money over truth. No trouble, he managed. Just complications. I'm coming over." "No." The word came out sharper than Jack intended. "Sarah, I need some space right now. To think." A long pause. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was smaller, uncertain. "You're scaring me." "Good," Jack thought with bitter clarity. "You should be scared. You should run as far from me as possible before the truth comes out." "I love you," he said instead. "You and David and the kids. Whatever happens, remember that." "Dad?" Jack hung up and immediately unplugged the landline. His cell phone remained off, severing the last connections to the world he'd built on Tommy Chen's grave. The silence that followed was absolute, pristine in its emptiness. He found himself walking through the house like a ghost haunting his own life. In his office, industry awards gathered dust on mahogany shelves, recognition for choreographing sequences that had thrilled millions while hiding the truth of how they were achieved. Each trophy felt like evidence now, proof of a career purchased with blood. The safe behind his desk contained the documents he'd hoped never to see again. Insurance reports from 1989, carefully edited to emphasize equipment failure over human negligence. Legal agreements with non-disclosure clauses thick as armor plating. And at the bottom, a single photograph. Tommy Chen at the wrap party for his first film, grinning at the camera with the infectious enthusiasm that had made him everyone's favorite. Jack had kept the photo as a reminder, though of what, he'd never been entirely sure. Guilt? Responsibility? Or just the last vestige of the man he'd been before he learned how easy it was to choose self-preservation over truth? His phone buzzed once, then again. Text messages bleeding through despite being turned off. The kind that emergency services used, impossible to block. Jack's hands shook as he read them. The first was from an unknown number. "The video goes live in 18 hours unless you call me. Mr." The second was from Chuck Norris himself. "Jack, heard about the incident. Whatever you need, you got it. We take care of our own." The third nearly brought him to his knees. "Papa Jack, Mommy says you're sad. I drew you a picture. Love, Emma." 3 messages that contained the entire scope of his disaster. Michael Reeves, counting down the hours until Jack's destruction. Chuck Norris, offering loyalty to a man who didn't deserve it. and Emma, 5 years old and innocent, still believing her grandfather was a hero. Jack sank into his desk chair and stared at the photograph of Tommy Chen. 25 years old when he died. Younger than Danny Reeves, younger than Sarah, with his whole life ahead of him until Jack's negligence and cowardice had cut it short. "I'm sorry," Jack whispered to the photo. "God help me, Tommy, I'm so sorry." But sorry wasn't enough. It had never been enough. The shadows lengthened across his office floor as the sun continued its arc toward evening. 17 hours remained until Michael Reeves made good on his threat. 17 hours to find a third option that didn't exist. Outside, seagulls cried their harsh songs to an indifferent ocean, and Jack Morrison, keeper of Hollywood's darkest secrets, began to understand that some traps were meant to be sprung. Jack stared at the 3 messages until the phone screen blurred, time stretching like taffy in the suffocating silence of his office. 17 hours. The countdown had become a living thing, each passing minute another step toward the gallows Michael Reeves had so carefully constructed. "We take care of our own." Chuck's message gnawed at him with particular cruelty. The aging action star had always embodied a code of honor that Hollywood had long since abandoned. Loyalty, integrity, standing by your people when the world turned ugly. Everything Jack had failed to be when it mattered most. He reached for his laptop with trembling fingers, pulling up the contact information for the Mojave production. Chuck was probably still on location, dealing with the chaos Jack had brought down on everyone. The least he could do was call off the dogs, let Chuck know that his loyalty was misplaced. But as Jack scrolled through the production files, something caught his eye. A document he'd never seen before, buried in the digital paperwork, an insurance rider dated 6 months ago, specifically covering legacy liability issues for key personnel. The signature at the bottom was barely legible, but the name was clear enough: M. Reeves, authorized agent. Jack's blood turned to ice water. Michael hadn't just orchestrated Danny's accident. He'd been planning this production from the beginning. Somehow, impossibly, he'd maneuvered himself into a position to influence the insurance coverage, the location, even the casting. Every element had been designed to create the perfect storm of guilt and consequence. With shaking hands, Jack opened another file, the original script submission. The writer was listed as Matthew Rivers, an anagram so obvious it made Jack sick. Michael Reeves had written the screenplay specifically for this production, crafting scenes that would force Jack to relive his worst nightmare. The fight sequence that had paralyzed Danny wasn't just similar to the one that killed Tommy, it was identical, down to the specific rigging requirements and safety protocols. The revelation hit Jack like a physical blow. Everything, the comeback opportunity, the chance to work with Chuck Norris, the redemption narrative he'd been so eager to embrace, all of it had been bait in an elaborate trap 15 years in the making. His phone rang. Unknown number, but Jack knew who it was before he answered. "Did you find my insurance paperwork?" Michael's voice carried a note of satisfied arrogance, like a chess master revealing checkmate 3 moves in advance. "You son of a bitch." Jack's voice was barely a whisper. "You planned all of this, the script, the production, your own son?" Danny volunteered. Michael's tone turned sharp, defensive. He knew the risks. He understood what justice required. Justice? Jack's grief exploded into rage. "You paralyzed your own son for revenge? What kind of father?" "The kind who doesn't abandon family when things get difficult." The words landed like a slap. "The kind who remembers that Tommy Chen was more than just a statistic in your career highlight reel." Jack felt the accusation burn through him, but something in Michael's voice had shifted. A crack in the controlled facade, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. "Tommy wasn't just your nephew," Jack said slowly, understanding dawning with horrible clarity. "Was he?" Silence stretched between them, heavy with 15 years of buried truth. "He was my son." Michael's voice broke on the words. "Tommy Chen was my son, you bastard. My ex-wife's name, but my blood. 25 years old and trying so hard to prove himself in an industry that eats kids like him for breakfast. He worshipped you, Jack. Talked about you constantly, how you were teaching him to be fearless, how you were going to make him a star." The photograph on Jack's desk seemed to pulse with new meaning. Tommy's eager smile, his desperate hunger for acceptance, the way he'd hung on Jack's every word during those final weeks. A young man trying to impress a father figure, willing to take any risk to prove himself worthy. "He called me the night before," Michael continued, his voice thick with remembered pain. "Said you were letting him do the big stunt, the money shot. He was so excited, so grateful. 'Dad's finally giving me my chance,' he said." Those were his last words to me. Jack closed his eyes, but the guilt offered no darkness to hide in. Every justification he'd constructed over the years crumbled under the weight of this new knowledge. Tommy hadn't just been a promising young stuntman, he'd been someone's beloved son, someone's whole world. "So, yes," Michael's voice turned cold again, professional. "I orchestrated all of this. The script, the insurance, the casting. I even convinced Danny to volunteer for the stunt team, though he doesn't know the real reason. Because sometimes justice requires sacrifice, Jack. Sometimes the only way to make someone understand what they've taken is to show them exactly what loss feels like. You're insane. I'm a father." Michael's arrogance crystallized into a single devastating line, something you will understand better when Emma grows up knowing what her Papa Jack really is. The line went dead, leaving Jack alone with the wreckage of everything he'd believed about that night 15 years ago. Chapter 7. Climax build up. The phone slipped from Jack's numb fingers, clattering against the hardwood floor like the sound of his own heart breaking. Michael's final words echoed in the sudden vacuum of silence. "Something you'll understand better when Emma grows up knowing what her Papa Jack really is." Jack staggered backward until his legs hit the desk chair, collapsing into it as if the weight of 15 years had finally crushed his ability to stand. Tommy Chen hadn't just been a promising young stuntman seeking approval. He'd been Michael's son, desperate for validation from the father figure who would ultimately destroy him. The parallel to Danny was so precise, it felt surgical, a scalpel drawn across old scar tissue to expose the infection beneath. His hands found the photograph again, studying Tommy's face with new understanding. Those eager eyes, that hungry smile. Jack had seen the same expression on Emma's face whenever she ran to greet him. The unconditional trust of someone who believed you could do no wrong, who looked to you for protection and guidance and love. "Dad's finally giving me my chance." Tommy's last words to his father, spoken with the joy of a son who thought he was about to make his dad proud. Instead, Jack's negligence had turned that hope into a funeral arrangement, a closed casket, and 15 years of a father's rage festering in the darkness. Jack's vision blurred as the full scope of his betrayal crystallized. It wasn't just Tommy who had died that night. It was Michael's faith in justice, in the possibility that good people were rewarded and bad people faced consequences. Jack had stolen that from him too, buried it under legal settlements and non-disclosure agreements, and the industry's collective amnesia. The office walls seemed to press inward, suffocating him with the weight of accumulated lies. Every award on those shelves was purchased with Tommy's blood. Every accolade, every comeback opportunity, every moment of pride in his professional legacy, all of it built on the grave of a young man who had trusted him completely. His phone buzzed against the floor. Another message from Emma, a photo this time, showing a crayon drawing of two stick figures holding hands under a crooked yellow sun. "Papa Jack and me," was written across the top in Sarah's careful handwriting, helping her daughter spell the words. The image hit Jack like a physical blow. In 12 hours, that innocent child would learn that her beloved grandfather was a monster. The man she ran to for hugs and stories and unconditional love would become a cautionary tale, a lesson about how even heroes could fall from grace. But wasn't that what he deserved? Hadn't he been hiding from this reckoning for 15 years, allowing Michael to carry his grief alone while Jack prospered from his silence? Tommy Chen had been someone's whole world, and Jack had snuffed that light out through arrogance and negligence and then, worst of all, cowardice. The grandfather Emma adored was a fiction anyway, a carefully constructed lie designed to hide the truth about what he'd done, who he really was beneath the legend. Maybe it was time for that lie to die. Jack retrieved his phone from the floor, his movements deliberate despite the tremor in his hands. The screen showed 14 missed calls from Marcus, 3 from Sarah, and a string of text messages from colleagues and reporters who'd gotten hold of his number. The entertainment press was circling like vultures, drawn by the scent of scandal and the promise of a fallen hero. But there was one number he needed to call first. Chuck answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the particular weariness of a man who'd spent the day managing a crisis he didn't understand. "Jack? Jesus, where have you been? The whole production's falling apart. Studio executives flying in from Los Angeles, lawyers everywhere, and the crew's scared they'll never work again. We need you here." "Chuck." Jack's voice sounded strange to his own ears, hollow and distant. "You need to walk away from this, from me, as far and as fast as you can." A pause. "What the hell does that mean?" "It means I'm not the man you think I am. It means your loyalty is misplaced. And in about 12 hours, everyone's going to know exactly why." "Jack, you're talking crazy. Whatever's going on..." Tommy Chen didn't die because of equipment failure. The words came out in a rush, 15 years of suppression finally breaking like a dam. "He died because I cut corners, because I pushed too hard, because I cared more about the shot than the safety protocols. And then I lied about it, covered it up, let the studio bury the truth to protect my career." The silence that followed stretched like a chasm. Jack could hear Chuck's breathing on the other end, the sound of a good man processing the confession of someone he'd trusted. "The kid yesterday," Chuck said finally. "Danny Reeves. His father is Tommy Chen's father, and he spent 15 years planning this moment." Jack closed his eyes, seeing Emma's drawing behind his eyelids. "I'm sorry, Chuck, for everything." The line went dead, leaving Jack alone with the sound of his own heartbeat and the weight of a decision that could no longer be avoided. #Chapter 8, Climax. Jack stared at his silent phone for 30 seconds before it erupted in his hands, Chuck's name blazing across the screen. He answered without thinking. "You coward!" Chuck's voice carried a fury Jack had never heard before, decades of accumulated respect curdling into disgust. 15 years I've known you. 15 years I've defended your reputation, recommended you for jobs, called you a friend. And you've been lying to my face every single day." "Chuck!" "No, you don't get to explain. You don't get to make this better with words." The sound of Chuck's breathing filled the line, sharp and controlled. "That boy is 23 years old, Jack. 23, and he's lying in a hospital bed with a broken spine because you were too much of a coward to face what you did the first time." The accusation hit harder than Jack expected. "You think I wanted this? You think I planned? I think you ran away instead of taking responsibility. And a good man spent 15 years drowning in grief while you collected awards and played the legend." Chuck's voice dropped to something colder than anger. "I think you let another father bury his son, rather than admit you weren't the hero everyone said you were." Jack felt something fundamental crack inside his chest. Chuck Norris, the man whose entire career was built on moral certainty, on the clear line between right and wrong, was looking at him and seeing only the villain. "I was 28 years old, Jack whispered. "I was scared. I made a mistake." "You were a man old enough to know better, old enough to understand that actions have consequences, old enough to choose truth over your precious career." Chuck's breathing steadied, becoming deliberate. "I'm calling the reporters myself, Jack. Whatever video that father has, whatever evidence he's planning to release, I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly where Chuck Norris stands when the truth comes out. Chuck, please. Goodbye, Jack, and I hope to God I never see you again." The line died with a finality that felt like a coffin closing. Jack stared at his phone until the screen went dark, then set it carefully on the desk beside Tommy Chen's photograph. In the space of 5 minutes, he'd lost the respect of the one man in Hollywood whose opinion had always mattered most. But Chuck was right. Every word had been surgical in its accuracy. Jack had spent 15 years playing the wounded legend, accepting sympathy and second chances while Michael Reeves carried his grief alone. The industry that had rallied around Jack after his tragedy had never known Tommy Chen's name, never mourned a young man's dreams cut short by negligence and pride. Jack opened his laptop and pulled up a blank document. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long moment, then began to type. "My name is Jack Morrison, and 15 years ago, I killed a young man named Tommy Chen." The words appeared on the screen like a confession written in blood. Jack stared at them, feeling something he hadn't experienced in years, the clean, sharp pain of absolute honesty. No euphemisms, no careful language designed to deflect blame, just the truth, raw and unprotected. His phone buzzed. A text from Michael, 11 hours, Jack. The video goes live at dawn. Unless... Jack deleted the message without reading the rest. Whatever ultimatum Michael planned to offer, whatever final demand for degradation or surrender, it no longer mattered. The choice had been made. The moment Chuck hung up on him, the moment Jack saw his own reflection in the eyes of a man who'd built his entire identity on moral courage. He continued typing, the words flowing now with the momentum of a dam finally bursting. Tommy was 25 years old, eager to prove himself, desperate for my approval. I was supposed to protect him. Instead, I pushed him beyond safe limits because I wanted the perfect shot, the moment that would define both our careers. When the rigging failed, when Tommy fell and didn't get up, my first thought wasn't about calling for help or taking responsibility. My first thought was about how this would affect my future. I let the studio lawyers handle everything. I signed the non-disclosure agreements. I accepted the narrative that painted me as a victim of circumstance rather than the architect of disaster. I built my comeback on Tommy's grave, and I've been hiding from that truth ever since. Jack's hands trembled as he saved the document. Through his office window, the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the sky. In a few hours, Michael's video would surface, and the entertainment world would learn what Jack Morrison was really capable of. But they wouldn't learn it from a grieving father's perfectly orchestrated revenge. They would learn it from Jack himself. He attached Tommy's photograph to the document, then opened his email and began typing addresses, entertainment reporters, industry publications, his agent, his daughter. Everyone who needed to know that the legend was finally ready to tell the truth. His finger hovered over the send button. Once this went out, there would be no taking it back, no return to the life he'd built on lies. Emma would grow up knowing exactly who Papa Jack really was. But maybe that was what love actually meant, having the courage to show someone the truth, even when it destroyed everything else. Jack Morrison pressed send and watched his world end with the quiet dignity of a man finally keeping his word. #Chapter 9, Resolution. The emails hit the internet like shrapnel from an explosion, spreading across entertainment news sites and social media platforms with the viral velocity that only comes from watching legends die in real time. Jack sat motionless in his office chair, watching his phone light up with notifications as his confession detonated through the industry that had made him a hero. The responses arrived in waves. First came the reporters, vultures circling with follow-up questions and requests for exclusive interviews. Then the colleagues, messages ranging from stunned disbelief to carefully worded statements distancing themselves from the fallout. His agent sent a terse email about exploring options and managing the narrative, corporate speak for abandonment dressed up in professional language. But it was Sarah's call that broke him. "Dad?" Her voice carried the particular strain of a parent trying to protect her child from something she didn't understand. "Emma keeps asking why people are saying bad things about Papa Jack on the news. I don't know what to tell her." Jack closed his eyes, feeling the weight of Emma's crayon drawing in his hands. Two stick figures holding hands under a crooked yellow sun, a child's perfect vision of love and safety that would never survive what came next. "Tell her the truth," he said quietly. "Tell her that Papa Jack made terrible mistakes, and now he has to face the consequences. Tell her that sometimes people we love disappoint us, but that doesn't mean the love was fake." Sarah's breathing hitched on the other end. "She's 6 years old, Dad. She doesn't understand consequences. She just knows that her grandfather is suddenly the bad guy in everyone's story." The accusation hung between them like a bridge burned beyond repair. Jack had taken his granddaughter's innocent faith and shattered it against the altar of his own guilt. Collateral damage in a war that should have ended 15 years ago. "I know," Jack whispered. "I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't fix this. Sorry doesn't protect her from the kids at school who'll connect her last name to the headlines." Sarah's voice cracked. "God, Dad, what did you do? What really happened that night?" Jack told her. All of it. The corner cutting, the pressure, Tommy's desperate need for approval, and 15 years of cowardice dressed up as grief. Sarah listened in silence, her breathing the only sign she hadn't hung up. When he finished, the quiet stretched like an open wound. "I need time," she said finally. "We need time. Don't call us for a while." The line went dead, taking with it the last connection to the life Jack had built on lies. He sat alone in his office as the sun climbed higher, watching the entertainment world dissect his confession with the clinical precision of surgeons examining a tumor. The story had everything the industry loved: a fallen hero, buried secrets, and the particular satisfaction that came from watching someone powerful face consequences for their actions. His phone rang once more. An unknown number, but Jack knew. "You actually did it." Michael's voice carried a note of genuine surprise, as if he'd planned for every contingency except honesty. "I was prepared for lawyers, for deflection, for another 15 years of lies, but you actually told the truth. How's Danny?" Jack asked. A pause. Angry. Confused. He volunteered for this, thinking he was helping his old man get justice, but he didn't expect this. Watching his father manipulate him, use him as ammunition in someone else's war. Michael's voice softened. "He may never forgive me." "Good," Jack said. "He shouldn't." "No," Michael agreed. "He shouldn't. Just like Tommy should have never needed to prove himself to you in the first place." The silence that followed felt different this time, not the charged tension of enemies circling each other, but the exhausted quiet of two men who'd finally stopped running from the same ghost. "Will it help?" Jack asked. "Knowing that I'm finished? That everyone knows what really happened?" "I don't know," Michael answered honestly. "Revenge is supposed to feel satisfying. Closure, they call it. But mostly I just feel empty. Tommy's still dead, Danny's still paralyzed, and you're still the man who chose his career over my son's life." "Yes," Jack said, "I am. At least now everyone else knows it too." The line went dead for the final time, leaving Jack alone with the ruins of everything he'd spent 15 years building. He walked to his window and looked out at the Hollywood Hills, where the morning sun cast everything in sharp relief. No shadows to hide in, no comfortable darkness to obscure the truth. Somewhere in this city, a young man named Danny Reeves was learning to navigate a world that would never be the same. Somewhere else, a little girl named Emma was trying to understand why the grandfather she'd loved had become a stranger overnight. Jack touched Tommy Chen's photograph one last time, then placed it carefully in his jacket pocket. He had phone calls to make, to Danny's doctors, to victims' rights organizations, to the families of every stuntman who'd worked under his direction and deserved to know the truth about the man they'd trusted. The legend of Jack Thunder Morrison was dead, but maybe in its place, something resembling an honest man could finally begin to live.